Now, here's a story that's been of concern and shocked a few people as well. French clergy apparently sexually abused more than 200,000 children over the past 70 years. And that's according to a major investigation released on Tuesday. Its authors say that the Catholic Church has turned a blind eye to the scourge for too long. Most of the victims were boys, many of them aged between 10 and 13. The author of a new book, The Outsider, Pope Francis and his battle to reform the Church, Christopher Lamb, is a British journalist who's is the Rome correspondent for the Catholic publication, The Tablets, and he joins us now via Zoom from London. Thanks very much indeed for joining us, and welcome to the programme.
Thank you for having me.
It is shocking to believe that as many as 200,000 children were abused in just 70 years by a place and an institution where people should be seeking safe haven.
Yes, it is shocking, and the figures are really disturbing, but the truth has to be faced by the Church, because unless the facts are revealed, unless the truth is faced up to, there can be no way of finding any kind of resolution and for helping victims and survivors and for making the necessary reforms. And I think one of the important things to remember about this report is that it was commissioned by the Church, by the French bishops, who said that they needed to get to the bottom of what had happened inside the Church over the last 60, 70 years when it came to abuse. They wanted to uncover the truth, and that, I think, is an important first step.
So this is sanctioned by the Vatican then?
It's commissioned by the French bishops, so not the Vatican, but the French Catholic Church.
But it has an impact on the Vatican, doesn't it, as the overall body of Catholicism?
Yes, it does. And the abuse crisis, I believe, presents the biggest crisis for the Church in 500 years since the Reformation, because it is not just a crisis of the abuse that took place in a setting that, as you said earlier, should be a safe setting for children and for everyone, but that it was not well handled and that it was mismanaged. And that is why it is such a serious crisis, because it challenges and demands that the Church reform its structures and its culture to ensure that this never happens again and that the lessons are learned.
Why do you think it was allowed to happen for so long? I mean, you know, even as a child, you'd hear stories, even if they weren't printed in the press, but there were rumors already going around. And this is 40 years ago, I remember hearing stories like this. So how is it that it's been allowed to happen for so long?
Well, I think abuse is a phenomenon that has occurred across institutions, not just the Church. It occurs in family settings, in all sorts of different places, and tragically, it has taken place in the Church, and there are many reasons for that, but I think the most important thing for the Church today is to respond to this crisis by, first of all, listening to the victims and survivors, hearing their stories, so understanding what they have to say, and to get a sense of how and why this happened. And secondly, to respond with concrete action to take steps to ensure that any church leader who doesn't handle abuse correctly, who covers up, who fails to report, that they are held accountable, that the church deals with the problem of clericalism, which is this idea that the priest has an elevated authority and is unaccountable, to deal with that problem in the church, because at its root, abuse of minors and of anyone is an abuse of power. So it is about addressing that underlying cause of an abuse of power that has occurred inside the church. It is very hard to pinpoint one single cause as to why it has happened, but I think we can see a range of factors that have allowed it to happen, and those must be tackled.
I'm reading here that it's 4,444 cases of child abuse were reported to the church. So we're not even talking about the ones that weren't reported. And it could be as many as 15% of the priests in some dioceses were perpetrators, which means that the church then were complicit because nothing happened on these cases.
Yes, that's right. And I think sadly and tragically, it's not just France. We've seen reports in many other countries to which tell a similar story. And you mentioned the Vatican earlier. This is a crisis for the global church, because it's not an isolated phenomenon. It's something that spans the whole church. And that's why it has to be responded to. And you talk about complicity. Well, I think, going back to what I said earlier, an important step was taken by the French bishops to actually commission this report. That shows that the bishops are willing to take the measures that are necessary to get to the bottom of this crisis. So that's a first step towards accountability, uncovering the truth. The next question that I think the church has to face up to is, how do you reform the cultures and structures that allow this complicity to take place, that led to a blind eye being turned or cover-ups happening? Those are big and searching questions that I know that Pope Francis wants to address, and that's why he is calling for a worldwide reform process in the church, a synod process that's starting this weekend, which is being launched this weekend in Rome, but also why he has changed the laws in the church to ensure that allegations are reported, that bishops are held accountable. And in 2019, he held the first ever summit of bishops from across the world to address the abuse crisis. That included bishops from across Africa, and in some places there is still some denial that abuse is a problem. But that summit that the Pope held in 2019 brought together bishops from all over the world, and they were forced to look at this and address this issue, and they heard from victims and survivors. So Pope Francis is pointing the way, but there is still a long way to go. And this report shows just how serious the crisis is and just how terrible the abuse scandal has been.
For some of the priests that may still be alive, are we looking at criminal action being taken against these perpetrators? Because, 200,000 victims, many of them may still be alive and still suffering.
Yeah, I think there's going to potentially be prosecutions, and I'm sure that the state will take the necessary actions there. There's also a question of whether bishops failed in their duty, And of course, you have laws that cover the failure to report in France. There was a cardinal in Lyon, Cardinal Barbarin, who was prosecuted, eventually found innocent, but was prosecuted for failure to report abuse. And so there are various avenues that can be taken there. There, of course, is the Church's own justice system. So if, let's say, the state does not pursue a charge against an individual, that individual can still be disciplined by the Church through the Church's own procedures. So that will have to be looked at. So I think the wheels of justice will have to turn. And there will have to be accountability for what has gone on.
I mean, all the Catholic Church can do is defrock someone, really, isn't it? I mean, that's hardly a punishment, I guess, when you consider the crimes. What about the idea of compensation for the victims? Is that something that's being mooted?
Well, I'm sure that is an option that's been pursued, as I'm sure you're aware, in the United States, where I think it's been several billion dollars have been paid out in compensation in total. Now it's probably a separate situation in France. It may not be the same number, the same amount of money, but I'm sure that there is absolutely nothing stopping victims of abuse from making their civil claims, their compensation claims.
What does this do for the brand Catholic Church? I mean, the numbers have been in decline over the years, so there are less Catholics, less members of the Catholic becoming Catholic. Will this create an even bigger problem for the Catholic Church in terms of trying to grow the church and bring in new members?
I think it does present a big challenge because, as you say, people will, and increasingly do, associate the church with this terrible scandal, particularly those who perhaps don't know very much about the Catholic Church, but never had come into contact with it. So the perception to the world at large is this one of shielding abusers, and I think that's a very, very serious situation. And but I go back to what Pope Francis has tried to do. What the Pope has tried to do throughout his 8.5-year pontificate is show a different face of the church, show a church that is merciful, a church that is seeking to serve, a church that is not failing to deal with the problems within its own ranks, but that the Pope has tried to root out corruption and wrongdoing, and has said very clearly, time and again, that the church is not a place for people to pursue their own agendas, or to try and build power, or try and abuse anyone. That is totally unacceptable. So Francis has been a pope who has tried to tackle corruption. He's been very much an anti-corruption pope. So yes, the brand is deeply damaged, but it's not beyond rescue. But of course, the response to abuse should not be, oh, how do we manage our brand better? The response of the church must be, how do we listen to survivors and victims of abuse who are part of the church, who are part of the community, who have been terribly, grievously wronged and have to live with the trauma of abuse for the rest of their life. How does the church respond to that?
But this is, I'm listening to this and I'm thinking, this has gone on for decades. And it sounds like a noble thing that the bishops have decided they've got to get to the bottom of this. But I just wonder if it isn't more about external pressure, social media, exposés that have basically forced their hand. And if these scandals hadn't been exposed, where would we be?
Well, you're quite right. It has often been the media or institutions, government institutions who have exposed this abuse and have forced the church to respond. But what's interesting about the France case is that it was the church itself who commissioned the report and commissioned the investigation. So rather than an outside entity coming in and saying, here, this is a problem, it was actually the church itself that has called itself to account. So we are seeing a shift here, and I think it's certainly in the Vatican, and from Pope Francis's vantage point, it is time for the church to not just wait for pressure from the outside, but the church must clean up its act and root out corruption of its own initiative without waiting for outside pressure.